I'm Dr. Michael Bonning, and the bishop is my favourite chess piece.
Okay, so Michael, Dr. Bonning, thank you for coming today. Let's play a game of Blitz and we'll do a bit of an interview as we go along. Okay,
Sounds good.
all right.
Great, that's me.
Four knights. Now, so Dr. Bonning, you're a...
Yeah, we forgot we were actually needed to talk about something as well.
Oh, that's all right. Yep. So you're a GP, so family doctor.
I am.
And you're also the chair of public health with AMA. So that's the Australian Medical Association rather than the American Medical Association. So tell me a little bit about that. Okay, in terms of your roles.
So, look, it's a great role. I don't focus so much on. I don't focus so much on. Sorry, Michael, if you.
Oh, that's right.
Yep, back to you. So much on kind of the things that public health does at a priorities level. You know, kind of delivering healthcare day to day. I'm thinking often a lot more about how healthcare works at a kind of whole of country level. So I end up thinking about gambling or vaping, advertising, fast foods, all of which are actually, in the end, really interesting things. They sometimes are, tricky in regard to how do you come to kind of a coherent picture on what to do. Sorry, thank you.
That's all right.
But you also end up in this just quite interesting space of seeing what government's kind of willing to do in certain circumstances. So their approach is fairly fairly interesting. Thank you. Is fairly interesting in as much as government is quite challenging when it comes to dealing with this, and gambling is a really good example because they have very strong commercial pushes from one side, but then they also have they have very strong community push from the other side. Most people will tell you that they don't want more poker machines. Most people will tell you they don't want to see one of the most complained about things on free-to-air TV is the number of sports betting ads. But it's very difficult to get government to move, and we know that. We've seen the Murphy report come through and make life quite difficult in the last while. It's gotten problematic. Well, that wasn't so good either.
That's all right. They're going to play chess.
The joys of all this. That's right. So, where do I? What do I do?
Yeah, so you're someone who works obviously in sort of policy space and in clinical general practice as well.
Yeah, and so I think that when you work in general practice, you see the downstream effects of things. And then you're always trying to work out trying to work out, what happens next, what can you do, how to, how do you actually influence what's going to play out. I'm sorry, Michael, your time. Beg your pardon.
You're getting.
So do I. What's gonna, what's gonna play out? How do you, how do you think about some of these problems or challenges? Where, where can you make a difference? Where can you actually get something done? And so taking what you do on the front line back through to what you can do at a policy level is actually really refreshing. I deal with so many times with people who don't see the downstream effects of what goes on.
Very good. So, a little bit tricky, I guess. How to play this? Oh, I just realised I made a mistake. That's all right.
What is chess but a collected set of mistakes that we make? So, yeah. It's this game of I need to work out how to get some firepower off the board there. So that wasn't a great swap.
Yeah, not so sure about that one.
But me neither. But where.
All right.
Well, I end up, because you've got more points on the board, I end up losing this, don't I? That was the wrong trade-off, I think, in the end.
I think that was probably unwise, that trade.
Thanks.
Yep. So actually, that was a mistake as well. I just realised, but you didn't punish me, so thank you very much. Yep. It's all good.
Yes.
Yeah, it's always a little bit tricky.
Trying to talk, think, and actually play some chess, which I'm not. Sorry. Oh yeah, forgetting I've also only got 20 seconds left, so. And There we go.
All right.
Well,
Very good. Yeah. It wasn't a great game by me either. So
no, this is good. Well, it certainly has happened, got me thinking, and then kind of forgetting the. I think what probably would have been the losing that queen. Trying to, I realised there probably wasn't an easy solution there, and yeah, you end up on a board with a rook and a queen in surplus to my.
Yes. No, you played well. Like in defense, I was under caffeinated before starting. Yeah. So Seth definitely made a few blunders there. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, because as the chair of public health of the AMA, so the Australian Medical Association, I think one of the policies that you've been working on or championing has been around sugar sweetened drinks. So fizzy drinks, pop, a number of names of things like Coca-Cola and Sprite and things like that. So tell me a little bit about sort of your thoughts about that and the policy approaches that we potentially could take as a society.
So sugar sweetened beverages and really focusing on kind of cola, soda, pop, soft drink, whatever you want to call it, has really no nutritional value. So let's start there. It's sugar that is very kind of in excess in our diet. So it's free, what we call free sugar. The challenge with it is also that it is drunk at increasing quantities, and it contributes to millions and millions of kilos of extra sugar in Australians' diets. Now, the challenge with that is that what we've seen is with increasing rates of type 2 diabetes, increasing obesity, we know that there's a commercial kind of backstory to this, that food and high-calorie food and drinks are more accessible than they've ever been. Even though we live in difficult times with cost of living, these kinds of foods and drinks that are highly palatable, that are kind of highly available, and are actually quite cheap comparatively to buying, say, an equivalent like water or buying fresh food and vegetables. When you look at foods, are driving many people to look at these high-calorie but low nutritional value products. And because of that, we're seeing that kind of spike our problems when it comes to type 2 diabetes and obesity. The first paper that we wrote internally at the AMA was about 2017 regarding a tax or a levy on sugar sweetened beverages. And the idea was always that you can achieve two things through this kind of levy. The first one is that you change people's purchasing habits by a levy of about 20 cents per 100 grams. You can work out a way in which sugar ends up being priced more expensively than other things that don't contain sugar or contain artificial sweeteners or don't contain any of these things at all. Now, that sends a price signal, and people are quite sensitive to price, especially those who are making these choices based on that they have cost of living pressures. The second is that you cause what we call reformulation, which is to deal with that price pressure problem that people might experience. Companies reformulate their drinks to have less sugar in them, and that ultimately ends up with, when we look at it at scale, with millions of kilos of sugar that is taken out of our diet, even if people continue to drink exactly the same way. Because companies have been brought to a compromise on their recipe, and also people have been brought to a different set of thinking and a price pressure, and they're price conscious about these things. So those two things are really the kind of the endpoints or the outcomes that you seek to achieve. And there are lots of countries where this is in place. There are also in some other countries, there are states, such as in the United States, where there are levies applied here. But your really good examples are Mexico, and the UK. So both of whom have seen really significant changes in purchaser behaviour since they introduced their sugar tax.
Right.
Mexico was one of the first in the mid last decade, and the UK followed not that long after.
Yep.
And those two things have meant that you reduce that, and you only focus, at least initially, on sugar sweetened beverages like soft drink or soda, because they have no nutritional value. Lots of people will talk to me about, well, why not orange juice? Why not flavoured milk? Well, both of those have some nutritional value. They may still contain lots of sugar, but you've got to start somewhere in this kind of long-term approach to better public health.
Yeah, it's sort of really interesting because I think so naively, when people talk about sort of a levy on sugar, so basically it's a tax. It's a tax on sugar in sugar drinks that it sends a price signal, but it sends a price signal by increasing the price. And for people who are, from a certain perspective, you could make the argument the people who are suffering most from this are also people who tend to be less well off. And so we're actually worsening their cost of living challenges. But the second aspect that it leads to a change in industry, so really in the environment of manufactured foods. From your understanding of countries where they have introduced these sort of policies, these sort of laws, which has been the greater effect? The change in consumer behaviour in terms of just sugary drinks being more expensive, or the effect of industry making changes in their formulation?
So overall, what you see as a starting point is that the tax revenue goes up a small amount because of this. So there is an outcome where people are spending more to purchase these drinks. That actually tails off over time because people change what they're purchasing because reformulation comes in. So the price signal and that concern actually only lasts for maybe a couple of years. And what we predominantly then see is a change to the industry as a whole, because as soon as people start moving to a lower sugar version or a no sugar version, they actually find that that's where they stay. That has, what we see from manufacturers, which is, however you set a law or a regulation, you will see manufacturers come in immediately under it. So if you set your sugar content at 20 grams per litre, they will come in at 19.9. And so part of this is also you start with a signal at a certain point, and then you may over time consider advancing that signal to continually drop the sugar content of these drinks. There will still always be a market for someone who says, I have a soft drink very infrequently. I want it to taste like it tasted when I was a kid. And those products still remain on the shelves, but they are a smaller and smaller proportion of the products that are sold, and therefore only a small proportion of the products sold end up being subject to that. And changing of behaviours requires some kind of signal. We haven't succeeded as a society in changing this behaviour by talking just about the fact that sugar and diabetes are a potential problem. And where you work, we have some of the highest rates of diabetes in the country, and where I work. And the challenge with that is that if we're not getting through on those measures, we have to start thinking of other policy approaches that might help us get somewhere. Overall, I agree with you. It's a hard policy approach. We may have been a bit soft on policy approaches to this point, and we know that for a short-term, for a short-term pain, we get a significant behavioural change. And it's essentially like, if I ask someone in practice to do more exercise, or I'm asking for some short-term pain to improve their cardiovascular fitness so that they can have a long-term period where they are healthier and their lives are better off. So just because this one is monetary doesn't necessarily always mean it's bad for that reason.
Yeah, it's like, I was reflecting that it's a complicated, like food is a complicated thing because obviously it's deeply cultural. Food's not just about nutrition and getting energy, it's also about pleasure and socialization.
That's it.
I personally quite like Coca-Cola, but I've got diabetes, so I have to try to avoid it now. Maybe maybe there's a bit of an association there for me. But you're absolutely right. Like, I think like where I work, so I work predominantly with a population living with severe mental illness. So not just anxiety, depression, but psychosis and bipolar disorder. And probably in the last 12 months, I've had 3 patients referred to me where initially on the referral, the HbA1c, so that's a measure of how well diabetes is controlled, how bad really the sugar is, was absolutely out of this world, like 12, 13%, so really, really bad. And the person was very symptomatic with the diabetes. Where realistically the only intervention I did for them was just note to them that they drank an absolutely extraordinary amount of sugary drinks. And unfortunately for a few people, they actually got into a bit of a sort of feedback cycle because the diabetes led them to pass a lot of urine. That's one of the symptoms of diabetes. And so they felt very thirsty, and so they would drink something to alleviate their thirst, but they would almost always drink more Coca-Cola or more Fanta or more Sprite. And so of course that pushes up their glucose even higher, drives more polyuria, so more passing of urine. So it was this unvirtuous cycle. And there was a lady I'm thinking of, so I sort of initially asked her to start some medication, but not a very high dose, but she sort of recognized, okay, maybe the sugary drinks is a problem, and she really did stop it all. And 3 months later, HbA1c dropped below 6%. I could barely believe it.
Fantastic. Yeah.
And it wasn't just one patient. So in the last 12 months, I've had 3 people. And a month ago, I was speaking to a young chap. So in his 20s, he's put on 60 kilograms in the last sort of 2 years. And I've sort of calculated separate to his food, he was probably having around 2 kilograms of sugar per week, just in the form of sugary drinks. And again, for someone at that level of caloric intake from sugar, probably cutting that out will actually, in fact, alleviate most of their the reason why they continue to put on weight and why they're feeling unwell.
I mean, I still vividly remember, and it's now more than 10 years ago, an 8-year-old child who weighed 80 kilos, 200 pounds, and coming to an understanding with his parents about this same problem of, there is just free or excess sugar in his diet through the form of, and he's 8, he doesn't go to the store on his own, he doesn't do the family shop, he is within an environment where we can control these things. Now, when we come out of that environment, so when we're an adult and we can make our own choices, we do end up in a situation where one of the most useful signals is price, and we can say price means quality. We can say price means, price means that something's been, being worked on or really well. Or, if you're buying a car, or if you're buying a house or something. But also we can recognise that price in amongst food is very much a sign of what people will make choices on. Now, people, I always start with this, people aren't necessarily always rational when it comes to decision making, and that's fine because food isn't just calories in, and what powers us to get through the day. It is cultural. It is, we have things that we find more appetizing. We find we have things that we're, I'm already finding this. I've got a 14-month-old son, and his likelihood of eating broccoli is lower than some of the other things that we might put in front of him. And people do act in ways that may not always be in their best interest. And you and I can say that to people as doctors. We can say that, hey, this would, but sometimes we need different forms of the message. And when I worked in a community down your way, down in Aids, what we found was we often needed 5 or 6 different messages. We needed a healthy alternative. We had we talked about water, but in some places we also had to work out that the water pipes needed to be fixed, or that access to water that tasted good wasn't necessarily easy. So what we talked about is the very low cost alternative wasn't necessarily available to everyone. And that always has to be a bit of a starting point too, which is, we can say just drink water or don't drink this, but if this is the cheapest thing and the most available thing in your community, the gradient that it drives you towards is using it. And I used to take the medical students that I taught around the local supermarket in this community, and I would show them that the soft drink aisle was an entire aisle, whereas the fresh food stand was maybe the size of 4 of these tables. It was it was the commercial realities following community behaviour, and then forming a feedback loop as well. So that aisle was growing, and we always had more products, and those products always sold, and they could stay on the shelf as long as they needed to because they lasted forever. And then you had this section here that was very underutilised, and part of what we had to then do was re-teach people how to think about fresh food, how to think about options that were better for them, even if those options were predominantly water or were beverages that might be fizzy drinks, but didn't necessarily have sugar in them. And just like in lots of areas, food science, and in this matter, drink science, has come a long way across the last 10, 15 years. We know that products formulated with no sugar are becoming more and more palatable to people, whereas original versions of soft drinks without sugar in them often had quite a hard metallic taste to them. So, and that's because of some of the original artificial sweeteners we used. So there's things going on that makes the transition easier, but there's also still commercial vested interest at the moment, because exactly as you described, that person who, because they drank more drink, they passed more urine, and it creates this vicious cycle. That vicious cycle is making someone, a corporation, a lot of money. And that vicious cycle doesn't necessarily exist when we don't, or it doesn't exist as strongly when drinks don't have significant amounts of sugar in them.
It's it is challenging, because I'm also sort of very mindful that for a lot of people, sweet drinks are just deeply pleasurable. It's enjoyable.
Our bodies are hardwired for it.
That's right. They live a hard life, and this is a simple pleasure. And one could take a sort of certain philosophical stance on who am I to, stand in someone's simple pleasures, especially if they don't seem like they're having any obvious immediate harm. But as we know from an aggregate population perspective, there is in fact quite substantial harm.
Huge.
Like as you mentioned, I think some of the newer sort of artificial sweeteners have made it easier. I usually tell people water is best, but the reality is I think a lot of people do find, if they are a heavy consumer of sweet drinks, that moving to a no sugar formulation is definitely easier. Like most people say that it's not the same.
Great.
But it's adequate.
Yes.
And for some people, that's enough for them to make a transition.
The same as we move people off smoking to nicotine replacements, they need something, and that something can be an artificially sweetened beverage. I mean, the other part is, yes, in the individual case, one drink here, one drink there, but as you say, it started out a sweet drink was a treat. Now, for many people, it forms a staple in their diet. It's an everyday or multiple times a day event, and that has been the change. Now, I was talking about food science. we have made almost everything that is processed more palatable, and in doing so, the technology behind it is often adding two things. It's it's adding more sugar, or it's making it other ways tastier, so that we consume more, and that has become really problematic with our diets, but including sugar sweetened beverages, is that all of this is on top of a caloric base, what we eat day to day, that is already well above probably what most of us need. And so as we live lives that often have less activity in them than generations prior to us, and more calories, those two things always, when they're out of alignment, result in our bodies doing what anthropologically or genetically and historically our bodies were always trained to do, which is when there is food around, we layer up with fat, fat around our bodies, because our bodies are designed to prepare for the hard times.
To prepare for famines that we don't have anymore, which in the Western world.
That's it. And there's just no environment where we're fighting biology, and unfortunately, commercial interests have hijacked biology to make these drinks and food as well so palatable that we just want to eat more and more of it. So, and that's hard to overcome, and so you have to create some other signals to help do that.
Yeah. Like I think some time ago, I can't quite remember where I read it. It might have been from the Freakonomics people. So talking about sort of sin taxes, so taxes on alcohol, tobacco, exercises, including potentially sugar. I can't remember if the article was specifically about sugar. And sort of making a sort of interesting economic argument that in a civil democracy, we have to tax something. There is a role for government, despite what some people say. Minimally, we need someone to enforce contracts and pay for policing and military. There is some role for government, even if you're a libertarian.
And maybe pay for the healthcare system.
That's right.
Which we both work in.
So there is some role for government, and that has to come from a collectivist approach to getting revenue. And if you're going to have to tax something, then surely having a tax on behaviours that we as a democratic society choose to say that we actually want less of this is probably better than taxing things that we actually want more of. So this country, like many countries, a large proportion of our tax base is through income tax. We actually want people to work more for the most part. So if it means that we can have broaden the tax base by taxing these other things, there's a side effect of potentially improving health outcomes and reducing harms from certain behaviours. That is still arguably less intrusive from a civil liberties perspective than just outright banning things, putting hard limits on corporations. That you can make perhaps a qualified justification why this is actually potentially better policies than other things.
And so that's how I've certainly thought about it in formulating this over years with the AMA, has been twofold. The first one is we shouldn't outright ban this. Unlike something like illicit drugs, it's very clear that in small doses, this is a quite reasonable thing that someone could enjoy from time to time. We can make an argument that people can, make their own choices, but that society shouldn't necessarily subsidise those choices because, and I say subsidise those choices because of all the healthcare and other things that we have to do. If your diet happens to contain lots of sugar, means that across the course of your life, you're going to see someone like me a lot more than maybe if you didn't. Now, that's not the whole story. Obviously, there's complex genetics and social environment and all kinds of other things that play into it. But we can at least do that. We can at least help change some decision making, and on aggregate, even if it means that you just drink some less, then that's probably across the course of a lifetime and across the course of a society, that's going to work out better for all of us. The second part is that we have called this what we call a hypothecated tax. It means that for the revenue you raise through taxing sugar, you push that money back into subsidising the cost of healthier alternatives. And you can target that to communities where water is less accessible, clean, taste, water that's doesn't have bad taste to it, and you might put it into those communities where bottled water or other services become cheaper. Or the second is that you make all fresh fruit, fruit and vegetables cheaper, so that people can spend more of their money on that, or get more for their money, so that we're pushing forward with kind of better alternatives. And that's harder for government to, because government doesn't like being told with hard limits about how they should spend their money. They like to have the freedom to operate. And
who thinks the general revenue make decisions afterwards?
Yeah, that's right. But our approach has been that if we really wanted to use this to drive public health outcomes, then you can't just say use a sin tax. You must also support better outcomes. And when I worked in a community in southwest Sydney, we put money from many of our programs where people paid a small amount to attend something into fruit and veg boxes. And that gave people, and we ran cooking classes. And so those two things put together were trying to undo that cycle, or that vicious cycle where people didn't have much access to fresh fruit and vegetables, but also because of that, they generationally had lost the art of cooking. So those two things, you've got to think about, not just this happens a lot.
It can't be just all stick.
Can't be all stick. You've got to have some carrot to go with it. You've got to have a pathway forward that incentivizes better behaviours. And so that was always how we've put forward this, this tax system would be to say, this is a behaviour that has outsized cost to our society. So you might think, well, I'm the one who pays for the drink, I pay my taxes, but we spend huge amounts of money on treating diabetes and obesity in our community. And then, so we can put a tax up front, and then the second thing is, but we should use that taxation revenue to fund better things that help alleviate those problems downstream.
Yeah, so I like to think in policy making in government, maybe this is a vain hope, that sort of decisions around policies are sort of based on purpose. Like, what are we trying to achieve? And I suppose we're not necessarily trying to achieve just a reduction in sugar consumption, but we actually want improved health for the population. That there's sort of certain principles. We want to maintain civil liberties, but we actually do want a healthier community. And from a justice perspective, if you didn't know exactly who you were going to be in the community, you probably want to be healthier rather than having a significant risk of being, potentially quite unhealthy, but having more access to sugary drinks.
That's it.
So if we sort of focus on purpose of what we're trying to achieve, then I think there are clearly risks of negative externalities when you introduce something like a tax. I think potentially we're seeing this in Australia with some of the tobacco excise. Possibly we're moving, we're getting some diminishing returns, I suspect, in terms of sort of counterfeit cigarettes and whatnot, even though the policy is very effective. We're having some policing issues now. But as long as we sort of focus on the purpose, then we've got something to aim for, because you have to ask yourself, is it actually meeting that purpose? And sometimes you don't know. You implement something and it works great, but something weird happens and it doesn't work, and you have to sort of turn around.
And that's something I'd like to see more of from government, which is to admit, even themselves, when they're like, this wasn't the best idea that we've ever had. We can own the fact that it was or wasn't a good idea, but good policy analysis, good evaluation of policy, which I think we don't see as much of here as we'd really like to. And it is very hard politically to roll things back unless there's a change of government, unless there's an ideological change in government, and then you can. But I'd like to see more of government, and I think Australians would be very comfortable with that idea. They'd say, yeah, I make mistakes sometimes too. It's nice to see when a government can own its faults, because too often I think they're worried about a focus on what's going to happen at the next election. Oh, you did this and then you pulled back from it, as opposed to we can try things, knowing that democracy, government, everything else, it's an experiment. Like we're always in the idea that we're trying something to then work out, well, what's the effect. And cigarette excise in Australia, which compared to overseas, might double or triple the price of a packet of cigarettes here, has been very effective. However, we are now getting to the point where the undercurrent of cigarettes that come in from countries illegally with no excise, so they don't meet Australian they don't come through an Australian customs process, have an excise placed on them, a tax essentially placed on them, are becoming so lucrative that they are now in a position where it's worthwhile for organised crime and others to bring them into the country. And, illicit tobacco now funds about $6.2 billion a year in the organised crime space.
Yeah, is it that high, is it?
Yeah, but against a whole industry of tobacco, which is more than $100 billion, it's a very small part. Yeah. But it's obviously growing compared to where it used to be. And so thinking then about, well, just like anything else, what are we going to, what's the policy response going to be? Because do you say to federal police and Customs and Border Protection that you should put importing illegal tobacco on the same level as importing methamphetamine or cocaine? Well, if you got to, that's a policy decision you've got to make, because that's potentially being worth almost as much. It's worth billions of dollars. It funds all kinds of other illicit activity. Would it be easier to, would it be just as productive for police and border protection to go after cartons and cartons and cartons and and shipping containers of illegal cigarettes coming into the country? Yeah. And it's very hard if you say to, if you and I were to go and talk public policy and public health to a police officer or someone who works screening containers coming into the country, and said it's just as bad overall that these cigarettes are coming in versus
the vibe's a bit wrong.
The vibe, and you've got to be able to work out how does that how does that work for
that the narrative has to make sense to individuals, even if in aggregate, it makes sense. Yeah.
That's right. So it's and that I think remains the challenge is, for all these kinds of public health challenges, is how do you make the narrative work? Because telling you can't or shouldn't have a sugary drink is actually easier once you've got diabetes, because you can see the problem. Yes. Me trying to tell a 22-year-old who's just put on a little bit of weight and wants to know, and I say, that's a much harder personal narrative to square. Yeah. So,
thank you very much for the game of chess and also the chat today. It was very, very enlightening. Sort of talking about some of these issues around policy approaches as opposed to necessary individual patient type approaches. So now I wanted to give you something. So, as you might know, I wrote a book last year. So this copy for you. I've put a message in, I signed it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and look, best of luck. So moving forward, I sort of understand you're sort of looking at furthering your career sort of in the policy space.
Yeah.
Look forward to speaking to you again.
Thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate it.
Good one.
Thanks.